The Heart of History by Weir. A Legacy of Pharaohs. Among the early centers of the urban revolution, the Egyptian is most generally familiar to us today. Perhaps this is because the expression of its myth and ritual in its beautiful art forms, its pyramid paintings, its statuary, and its temples have such a great appeal. When we contemplate these, it can easily escape our notice that at the beginning, they all had to do with governance. When we see a statue of the falcon-headed Horus, do we recall that he and the pharaoh were one and the same? Or when we look at a painting of Osiris enthroned with crook and flail, do we remember he was the recently deceased pharaoh and now king of the realm of the departed? Do we know that the lovely Isis, the seat, was the personification of the throne? Indeed, an entire panoply of gods and goddesses had to do primarily with the royalty and the aesthetically balanced arrangement of the dual kingdom. Nor was Egypt at all exceptional in this, for myth and ritual in the cultures of the ancient world were expressions of the forms of social order and the monarchies that governed them. On looking into the early urban culture of ancient Egypt, one becomes impressed with the sense of sure order that suffuses through the whole pattern. Its model was the dependable regularity of the ebb and flow of the Nile, the very bloodstream of its organism and source of its vitality. In this same spirit, the myth and ritual of its kingship in its evolution passed through an unusually clearly articulated sequence of developments from an absolute divine monarchy and collective moral order, and through states of gradual democratization of its royal prerogatives, to an outcome in which the sense of the moral responsibility of the individual emerged into clear expression. In the early years of the Old Kingdom, the ceremonial governmental forms were permeated throughout with a sure conviction of the utter regularity in the order of the cosmos and its divine agencies. Only later did the realities of the actual subsequent history disappoint these expectations, for when things were prosperous, the pharaoh had only to govern his own daily activities with ceremonial rigor, and the kingdom would find itself correspondingly well governed. He had only to strike a firm stance as victor in war, and the campaigns would of themselves, almost by definition, be victorious. When, on the other hand, there occurred sorrowful times of disruption of this order, wise men and prophets held on to their faith enough to remind their rulers urgently that the reason for the troubles was their failure to sustain the divine plan in accord with their duty as kings. This habit of mystic ideation, so intensely focused upon regularity, could only lead to an ethical sense that would prove to be equally founded upon the sure rule of integrity. On the other hand, as the history unfolded, it becomes evident to us that Egypt never reached the level of development that might envision the function of compassion among and between the people as a bonding principle, giving society its cohesive force. Beneficent loving kindness remained always in the hands of the king to give forth to his flock as their good shepherd. The Sacral Kingship. Nevertheless, Egypt's history affords many observations that are of value to the theme under discussion. The first concerns the very beginning of this ceremonial kingship, from which emerges a striking picture of the genesis of myth and ritual forms. If one were to entertain the notion, as I once did, that the higher myths came into being by a gradual sophistication of folk beliefs, one would have to be brought to a radical revision of that supposition by the example of early Egypt. For here the mythic interrelations between Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Horus were established de novo at the start of the urban revolution, and prevailed in their main outlines for the following 3 millennia, though with many modifications. When the first pharaoh of a certain name accompanied the military feat of uniting Upper and Lower Egypt, he proved himself a titan, not only in war-making but in myth-making as well, for he created a justification for his universal rule by the explication of it in his Memphine theology. In it, the several regional deities who had been worshipped in the nomes or local city kingdoms were brought into a new relation to each other by an act of creative innovation. we are left with the conclusion that this must have been the fruit of a visionary work by this first pharaoh. It led Frankfurt to recognize him as a creative genius. Thus arose a mythology that was given to a populace by their new ruler, a development downward from the top rather than its rising from the folk upward. In its essence, this theology was a successful formulation of the reconciling of opposite powers and realms. Seth, the god of the Upper Egypt, and Horus, that of Lower Egypt, were to stop their quarreling. Under this new regime conceived as the work of the 9 principal deities, the Aenad, Horus was to wear the crown of both lands and be embodied in the ruling pharaoh. This dual kingship of the 2 lands was reflected not only in the double crown, but in all the offices of government as well, each correspondingly dual. In another dimension, 2 kingships were established, that of Horus, the ruler of the living, and that of Osiris as chief of the realm of the dead. Each Horus king upon his death was ritually inducted into his enthronement over the realm of the ancestors through his transfiguration, by which he became an Osiris, while his son assumed the monarchy of the dual kingdom to become Horus. The center. The imagery of the center in Egypt's ceremonial is of particular moment for the purposes of this present investigation. The pharaoh was clearly the embodiment of the governing center, enthroned upon a dais which symbolized the primordial mound, that first spot of land from which the whole earth spread into its extensity at the time of its creation by Atum. At this coronation, he released geese into their flight in the 4 directions and shot arrows towards the cardinal points of the compass. His capital city, Memphis, standing as it did between the 2 lands, represented the midpoint of the earth. As well as in this form of centrality, he also embodied the entirety of the whole realm. So specifically was this expressed that his every move during the day was ceremonially portraying what was transpiring throughout the society to such a degree that any ritual fault could engender ill fortune for its welfare. The giver of life and the giver of order. As the personification of the center and of the whole, the king was at the same time the unique man in the earliest of the Old Kingdom, the only individual to possess a soul which would live on into immortality through its transfiguration into an Osiris. In this aspect, he was not only giver of order, but giver of life as well. That is, both the order and organization of society emanated from his person, and also the life principle itself. He governed in the embrace of his father Osiris, indicated ritually by his wearing a gold stomacher representing the arms of his father. The sense here was that the life-giving energy was provided from the underworld by the ancestors and channeled through their chief Osiris, and thus into the person of Horus the king, from whom it radiated outwards throughout the realm of living beings. The ideal of the Egyptian kingship was founded upon the concept of a vital force, a Ka, which gave life and order to the kingdom, that is, to the whole world. The king's Ka was a composite of various deities representing the qualities of his rule. These divine components, as Wilson sums them up, combine into a blend of sustenance and punishment. Here again is an array of opposites reconciled in the personification of the center. How deeply the king's being was felt as a presence in the life of the people is expressed beautifully in a poem of counsel by a state official to his children, urging them to worship him within their bodies and associate with him in their hearts. He is the perception which is in men's heart, and his eyes search out every body. He is Ra, by whose beams one sees. He is one who illumines the 2 lands more than a sun disk. He is one who makes the land greener than does a high Nile, for he has filled the 2 lands with strength and life. The nostrils are chilled when he inclines towards rage, but when he is merciful, they will breathe the air. The king's Ka, his vital force, was the source of Ka of all people, who in this fashion mystically participated in his being as he did in theirs. While the life-giving energies came from Osiris and the underworld through the king, those that provided the organizing principle of the moral order originated from the sky, while Osiris had as his attributes the waxing and waning qualities of the moon, the Nile, and vegetation. Ra, as the divinity of the sun, was characterized by his absolute regularity. Called the Son of Righteousness, he was the legendary author of the Kingship and its first ruler in the time that was later looked upon as a golden age. He thus personified the sure order of society and the organization of the realm, that is, all that became the collective moral tradition and law. All later prophetic calls for reforms in times of disorder had reference to Ra as the organizer and prototype of ethical rule. His daughter was Ma, who personified right order, righteousness, right doing, or truth. The implication being that truth is not so much something you think, but what you do. There are repeated allusions to virtue as doing the truth. This is a certain parallel here between Osiris conveying vital force through the king's Ka and Ma'at suffusing righteousness throughout the realm through the person of the king. Visionary experience. As I have already mentioned, this entire system of symbolic expression in the myth and ritual of early Egyptian kingship appeared de novo when the first pharaoh through his conquests united Upper and Lower Egypt. The Memphite theology was a brilliant product of visionary creation. How frequently the further stages in the changes and differentiations in the long histories of Egypt's ceremonial were initiated through visionary experiences of rulers cannot be discerned from the records, though it cannot have been rare among a people so habitually occupied with their deities. There is a dramatic passage that has come down to us from the 15th century BC, telling of a visionary state in which the god made Thutmose III his choice for the kingship when he was a young priest serving in the temple. This god was the ram-headed Amon, who was elevated to supremacy in the mythology of the monarchy in those times. Especially was this the work of Hatshepsut, the young prince's redoubtable aunt and stepmother, who was restoring the ritual centers after their devastation some while before at the hands of an Asian people, the Hyksos, who had captured the rule of Egypt for a century and a half. The young prince wrote, "The god Amon, he is my father and I am his son. He commanded to me that I should be upon his throne, while I was still a nestling. He begot from me the very middle of his heart and chose me for the kingship." As the young priest stood in the hall of the temple, Amon-Ra came forth from the glory of his horizon. He made heaven and earth festive with his beauty, and he began a great marvel. The god recognized him and stopped, while the young priest bowed to the ground. The god worked a marvel remote from the faces of mankind and mysterious in the hearts of the gods. He opened for me the doors of heaven. He spread open for me the portals of its horizon. I flew up to the sky as a divine falcon, that I might see his mysterious form, which is heaven, that I might adore his majesty. I saw the forms of being of the horizon god on his mysterious ways in heaven. Ra then established him with the dual crowns and dignities of a god, with the Urias spirit, the falcon, and the strength of the mighty bull. He made me wear the two goddesses, the crowns. He made my kingship to endure like Ra in heaven. He was endowed by the god with a victory and dominion over the foreign lands, to rouse terror and to extend the frontiers of the realm, that is, of the ordered world. In return, the pharaoh piously tended and provided for the god's temple. His reign was unusually long and prosperous, 55 years of rule being exceptional in those days. His innovative contribution to Egypt was his shifting of policy from a somewhat isolationist governmental housekeeping to an active and successful program of extending the bounds of empire into the countries towards the northeast, bringing in a wealth of revenues from them. The moral order. In the long history of Egypt's thought process of A special moment for the purpose of this discussion is the gradual democratization of kingly forms in a way that engendered the moral sense within the conscience of the individuals. In the earliest years of the monarchy, the figure of Ra presided over the sphere of the distinction between right and wrong, or as the language of the time put it, between that which is loved and that which is hated. His daughter Ma'at came into being out of an impressive vision of the enduring state and its ever-functioning organization, being a moral order of the world identified with the rule of the pharaoh. This ethical order was solidly embedded in custom and tradition, a point stressed by a monarch of the end of the early period in his instructions to his son, Mercure. With profound respect for the wisdom cultivated in the Old Kingdom, he tells his son that for the wise man, truth, or Ma'at, comes to him well brewed after the manner of the ancestors. Imitate thy fathers, thy ancestors, for lo, their words abide in writing. Open that thou mayest read and imitate knowledge. What a striking statement of the non-individual, collective form of virtue, to imitate the fathers and even to imitate knowledge. Righteousness and justice were to be entirely according to the ancestors, the product of their work, as the pharaoh Ptahhotep of the 5th dynasty saw it. For him, government was to be conducted in the spirit of kindliness and wisdom, virtues that begin with the family relationship and reach out from there into the official relations of the state. The king was imbued with the effective forces, the virtues of righteousness and justice derived from Ra and personified in Ma'at and conveyed through his person to the realm. A time of troubles. By contrast, we come now to a dramatic display of the opposite effects of the individuality that had been lodged in the kingship. The Old Kingdom was brought to its demise and a time of troubles ensued, when the aristocracy began to lay claim to its right to exert independently the kind of power and dominance that had been strictly the prerogative of kings. The central authority of the kingship lost its hold, and the realm became instead a loosely coordinated group of feudal states under autonomous rule that was often irresponsible. The sure order of Ma'at began to disintegrate, and men lost their confidence in the blessings issuing from the king's transformation at his death. As Breasted points out, on the one hand, an attitude of skepticism prevailed in those years, representing an abandonment of the erstwhile acquiescence to authority and tradition so characteristic of the Old Kingdom, and thus a loss of stability. On the other hand, this resulted in a gradual growth of the recognition of the individual's power to believe or not to believe as a conscious choice. This, then, was a step backward in social order, but a forward in self-awareness and personal initiative. The individual was emerging as a moral force with a sense of conscience as the ultimate authority. Prophets and reformers. The role of prophets and philosophers became vividly active in evil times when the kingship was weak and decadent. It was not certain that they spoke from experiences of visions that might create new myths, but they did function as wardens and keepers of myth and ritual traditions, and they urged their rulers to resume a fidelity to the ancestral ideal of kingship for which they were responsible. With the prevailing sense of disillusion in regard to the absoluteness of the divine kingship, the normative functions of society were disintegrating. These conditions of distress and dissonance were characteristic for the rise of prophets who would speak out against the ills of the times and envision the advent of one who would, by the divine election, restore the ideal of the righteous one. One of these was Weir, who specified the abuses of the social order and proclaimed the advent of the true king. Why really the ways are not guarded roads? Would that it were the end of men, no conception, no birth. Then the earth would cease from noise without wrangling. Why really grain has perished on every side? Everybody says there is nothing. The storehouse is stripped bare, its keeper is stretched out on the ground. Would that I had raised my voice at that time, it might have saved me from the suffering in which I am. Behold now, It has come to a point where the land is despoiled of the kingship by a few irresponsible men. Behold, not an office in its proper place, like a stampeded herd which has no herdsman. The text has lacunae at this point, but the theme shifts wistfully to the true pharaoh who should represent the much-needed ideal of the kingship in the image of the god shepherd. It shall come that he brings coolness upon the heart. Men shall say, he is the herdsman of all men. Evil is not in his heart. Though his herds may be small, still he has spent the day caring for them. Would that he might perceive their character from the very first generation. Then he would smite down evil. He would stretch forth the arm against it. He would destroy the seed thereof and the inheritance. But there is no pilot in the hour. Where is he today? Is he then sleeping? Behold, the glory thereof cannot be seen. He then reiterates that authority, perception, and justice are the attributes of kingship, yet that the present pharaoh seems to prefer to let confusion and contention reign instead, both by his action and his lying. Another example of propheticism comes from a Middle Kingdom text that relates in retrospect the story of a sage of the fourth destiny, roughly 5 centuries earlier. He had foretold the downfall of the Old Kingdom and the consequent social chaos. Of greatest significance had been his declaration that the remedy must lie in the return of the quality of the first creation and its ideal conditions, as established by the sun god Ra, who personified the ordering of society. Then he had expressed the hope that a new ruler would rise who would, as a king of messianic savior, reorder the realm. The sovereign now bids the sage, Nefereti or Neferohu, to speak forth not of the past but of future events, and he replies in writing, Reconstruct my heart, how thou bewildest this land in which thou didst begin. To be silent is repression. Behold, there is something about which men speak as terrifying, for behold, the great man is a thing passed away in the land where thou didst begin. Be not lax, behold, is before thy face. Mayest thou rise up against what is before thee, for behold, although great men are concerned with the land, what has been done is as what is not done. Ra must begin the foundation of the earth over again. The land is completely perished. How is this land? The sun disk is covered over. This land is helter-skelter. The face is death, for silence confronts. I show thee the land topsy-turvy. He separated himself from mankind. After these and many such portrayals of the evil of the times, the vision of the ideal king then is proclaimed, that is, Amen, Amen, Emmet, of the Middle Kingdom, for whom this is written. Then it is that a king will come, belonging to the south. Ameni, the triumphant, his name. Rejoice, you people of his time. The son of a man will make his name forever and ever. The evil and rebellious will be silenced. Enemies will fall to his sword. His wrath will descend upon rebels and the treacherous. The serpent which is on his brow, still for him the treacherous of heart, and justice will come into its place. While wrongdoing is driven out, rejoice, he who may behold this and who may be in the service of the king. Breasted has emphasized how respectfully the pharaohs of later dynasties, after some centuries had passed, alluded to the sayings of these early prophets to substantiate their claim to be faithful upholders of the ideal of the kingship. These prophetic admonitions resulted in a renewed hope for social order to be upheld by just kings, and the pessimism of the early feudal age gave way to a new effort among the official class to apply this recently developed sense of conscience to their functions. Egypt became ready to revivify its kingship in the person of this Amenemhet, first pharaoh of the Middle Kingdom, the one who in these instructions to his advisor quoted the prophets. He advocated a program of social justice and kindness as evidence that the king loved his people, with the religious conviction that these moral ideals were the decree of the god. Democratization. A time of troubles like that of the feudal age, the first intermediate period, may lead either to prophetic calls for a faithful return to the tried and trusted ways of the tradition established by the ancestors, or else to a visionary creation of a new myth and ritual forms. The latter, while it may draw upon the ideals set forth to the earsight of the cult founders, still transforms them to meet the fresh challenges of cultural conditions when these have changed too radically to allow the restoration of long-standing custom. Toynbee's formulation of the innovative work of a creative proletariat giving rise to a new religious cult led him to the conception of a new Osirian church emerging out of the Egyptian time of troubles. Frankfurt dispelled this notion with cutting criticism based upon information coming increasingly to light after Toynbee's time. He found no evidence of such an Osirian church. Clearly, Egypt went the other way of restoration. With the establishment of the Middle Kingdom, the ideal of kingship personified in the figure of Ra was renewed, giving rise to an impressive social regeneration and consequent fresh power and dominance of the state. Of note for our present discussion, though, it appears that another train of events was taking place, one that proved to be of greater psychological import, that did indeed involve the Osirian motif and did affect the life of the common man. This development was the gradual democratization of kingly forms concerning the afterlife. Egypt's myth and ritual consisted of two major species, its kingship and its mortuary cult. One might see these as the traditions of Horus and of Osiris, the living king and the deceased king. The former heritage, as we have noted, was restored to its old strength following the model attributed to Ra as its founder. The latter heritage, on the other hand, went through striking changes. The concept that had prevailed at the start, according to which the king as unique man was the only true individual with an immortal soul and with the sole prerogative of becoming Osiris as death, was somewhat short-lived. It was not long before courtiers and high officials of the realm chose to be buried in tombs close to that of their royal master, in the hope of accompanying him on his journey into the next world. This was the beginning of an outward and downward dissemination of the royal prerogative, and it soon entailed not only the mortuary privileges, but hand in hand with them, also the increased power of the high officials relative to their kings. In the feudal age, these developments reached their extreme in both these aspects. Mortuary customs showed the officials were no longer huddling about the royal tombs to be brought along on their king's journey. Rather, they were housed at death in their own magnificent tombs, independently in their own provinces, and were buried with the rituals derived from the kingship of becoming each one in Osiris. Along with this, their power grew to be so autonomous that the central authority lost its supremacy, and the realm became a scattered assortment of feudal states. Egypt became replete with great individuals. The term democratization not only applies to this dissemination of royal prerogatives, but also to developments that went much farther in the direction of human equality. The last judgment that had assessed the king's righteousness and justice on the threshold of his transfiguration was now shared by all. The coffin text of this age, reflecting the pattern of the former pyramid text and containing prayers once used on behalf of the kings only, were now written for not only the official but also the middle class. They began to declare a new equality. Ra says all men are equally responsible at the judgment, for I have made every man like his brother. Brescia concludes that this new awareness of moral responsibility in respect to the Last Judgment had a powerful influence for righteousness in Egyptian life. In this mortuary theology, Osiris, always the favorite of the common people, did in fact take the ascendancy, though not in the sense of establishing a new cult or a church as a distinct religious grouping. The mythic worlds of monarchs and of commoners became intermingled. As Brescia notes, the celestial figure of Ra now became depicted as traveling in his solar bark through the underworld domain of Osiris. and at the same time Osiris became increasingly solarized and presided over the Last Judgment, formerly the function of Ra, being justified at the weighing of souls before the throne, at one time a requirement for the king alone, now was everyone's concern, providing only that a deceased individual had the funds to pay for this Egyptian way of death. Any soul could now become an Osiris. All social distinctions were now said to be leveled according to the Creator's intention at the beginning of time, so that all men found themselves on the same plane of moral responsibility, all equal before the law. What could be a more clear representation of the psychological meaning of democracy? Long before it had any connotation of representative government or any right to vote, it had the significance of a species of consciousness marked by a sense of social responsibility. Equality meant not the right for all to share in privileges of wealth and prosperity, so much as the answerability of all individuals concerning questions of the well-being of society, that is, of each other. This kind of consciousness clearly began in the archetypal myth and ritual framework in which the psychic center was personified in a sacral king who presided over the welfare of his people with a parentalistic and benign caring. He was a super father of a super clan whose duty was to love the subjects for whom he was responsible, and toward these ends was, at the start, the sole carrier of the principles of righteousness and justice. His annual rites of renewal at the New Year festival, with his combat against the forces of disruption and chaos, were measures to preserve his potency as giver of order and giver of life, so that the people might flourish. The democratization of this functioning of the archetypal center amounted to its realization within the psyche of each member of the society. Order and life were everyone's business, and the moral consciousness and conscience were born in all. Akhenaten, a visionary king. The most unusual and colorful visionary among the pharaohs was, of course, Akhenaten, in the 14th century BC, who proclaimed the final culmination of the prophetic development in the image of the Son of Righteousness. His short reign of theological, mythological, and social reform became a brief flowering of a new vision of monotheistic, ethical, and rational order arising out of his adoration of an all-embracing divinity, Aten, the disk of the sun in whom he found all that was good and beautiful in creation. His ardor was so excessive that he closed out all manifestations of worship of other deities. Since the consequent unemployment rate among priests and attendants of the numerous temples to other deities rose sharply, and long accustomed and much loved faiths were forbidden, the reforms were soon rejected by the entire realm, and the king found himself isolated with his own predilections. The kingdom inevitably returned to its old ways, yet this did amount to a first attempt in the near Far East at such a vision. It only needed to await its time for a fuller historical readiness in the slower evolution of cultures elsewhere. A veritable anomaly among pharaohs, Akhenaten's 16-year rule defied all tradition and temporarily revolutionized the myth and ritual forms. He has been called a prophet of nature and human life, conceiving a great moral order of a new kind, his soul moved chiefly by the emotions. Many hymns in adoration of Aten have come down to us, replete with joyous emotion evoked by beauty in nature and human nature. As Breasted puts it, all this discloses a discernment of the universal presence of a God in nature, a mystic conviction of the recognition of that presence in all creatures. Showing Akhenaten to be a God-intoxicated man, he was a visionary who did indeed perceive the quality of love with a poet's eye. A prayer to his exalts in this: may my eyes be satisfied daily with beholding him, when he dawns in this house of Aten and fills it with his own self by his beams, beauteous in love, and lays them upon me in satisfying love, forever and ever. In his rapture, he identified this light with love, also with beauty, indicating God's presence. However, mystic though he was, entranced with the love and beauty in the divine and finding that all creatures are imbued with them, he did not reach the perception of this love as a bonding force among members of society. Rather, he still remained in the tradition of kingship as the mediating agency through which the people received these blessings. He thus saw his role in the same terms as those proclaimed by the former prophets of the feudal age, already mentioned, that is, as valiant herdsman and shepherd of men, reflecting thus the demeanor of his Aton with his fatherly solicitude for all creatures, as he said, Father and Mother of all that thou hast made. Summary. In summation of ancient Egypt's history, it must unfortunately be recognized that although its 2 millennia of experience revealed many tendencies toward a new consciousness of social responsibility, still the strongly conservative nature of the people prevented these from attaining fruition. Wilson, writing several decades later than Breasted, and basing his conclusions on an enlarged accumulation of data, pronounced a somewhat negative judgment on the eventualities of Egypt's history. He felt that the idea of social justice did not survive the restoration of political stability and prosperity in the Middle Kingdom's later years, in which the pharaoh's high prerogatives were returned to him. A sense of national insecurity in the later part of the 2nd millennium BC effectively ended any advocacy of rights of the individual and forced every citizen into submissive acceptance of the transcendent right of the state. The familiar outcome was the resigned conclusion that surrender and obedience would be rewarded in the afterlife. I would suggest that if it had not been that the heavy hand of tradition and authority prevailed so strongly, and if a more radical transformation of the order of Egyptian society had been proposed by the prophets, there might have been some appearance of the theme of world destruction and regeneration in their vision. The closest they came to this was their appeal for a return to the spirit of the Irizite, the time of the beginning of the creation in its golden age. The outstanding observation gleaned from this Egyptian history, then, is the picture of a strong evolutionary trend concerning individuality. From the early forms in which this individuality was lodged in the kingship at the center of the world and the summit of the hierarchy, there tended to take place a step-by-step dissemination of it outward and downward by the common people. It looked for a while as if the ordinary citizen would assume the responsibility for the welfare of society and of his afterlife. Only the restitution of authoritarian rule from the top, combined with the acquiescence of people to a life of obedience, thwarted this possibility. I would hazard the conjecture that if the principle of loving brotherhood had been realized, this history might have gone differently. Perhaps it was all too early in the evolutionary unfolding of the psyche for that to happen. It was instead the fortunate lot of China to introduce this principle onto the stage of history.